No one expected this moment. The arena went dead silent, and then exploded. The most shocking SmackDown return of the year. But what we saw, that eruption of noise and confusion, was only the beginning. The real story, the one that unfolded in the shadows, in the hushed whispers of the locker room and in the panicked calls of producers, was so much more complex. This wasn't just a return, it was a reckoning. What we perceived as a triumph was, in reality, the first chapter of a story so painful, so deep, it would threaten to change the very foundation of the women's division. To understand what happened, you have to understand the silence that came first. That deafening, terrifying, all-consuming void that lasted maybe 3 seconds, but felt like an eternity. It was a collective gasp, a pause in the universe. The champion was in the ring, her arm raised, her victory assured. The show was supposed to be over. Credits were ready to roll. But then, the lights cut. Not the usual aggressive blackout. They faded, slowly, drained of color, leaving only a single cold blue spotlight on the ramp. And in that silence, a single sound cut through the air. Not music, a sound like a music box winding down. And then, her. Standing there, not in ring gear but in street clothes. She hadn't just come back to wrestle. She had come back to haunt. The sound that erupted wasn't a cheer. Not at first. It was a scream. A collective, primal noise of disbelief. 10,000 people trying to process an image their brains told them was impossible. Ilara, the one who vanished. The woman who walked away 3 years ago, not with an injury but with a quiet, cryptic statement posted online, and then nothing. She evaporated. She left the championship on the table. She left her tag team partner, the current champion, Serafina, to answer for her disappearance. And now, she was back. The camera zoomed in on her face. She looked older. The youthful fire was gone, replaced by something colder, something harder. A small scar, previously unseen, traced her jawline. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, she just stared. Stared past the audience, past the lights, her eyes locked on the champion in the ring. The commentary team was speechless. One of them had his hand over his mouth. The other just kept repeating, "It can't be, it's not her, it cannot be her." But it was. The moment stretched, the sound of the crowd washing over her like a wave she didn't even feel. She took one step, then another. The walk she was making wasn't to the ring. It was to an execution. The champion, Serafina, her former best friend, hadn't moved. Her face was pale as if she'd seen a ghost, and in every way that mattered she had. In the ring, the champion, Serafina, was frozen. The championship belt, the one she had just defended, slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered to the mat. The sound was inaudible against the roar, but the visual was deafening. This wasn't the return of a challenger. This was the return of a past she had meticulously buried. The camera cut to the front row. A young woman, mascara running down her face, was sobbing. Not tears of joy, tears of profound, agonizing shock. She held up a sign, faded and worn, that she must have brought to every show for 3 years. It read, "Where are you, Ilara?" Now, the sign just trembled. Nearby, a man was yelling, but not in anger. He was yelling in confusion, pointing at the ring, then at Ilara, as if trying to connect 2 impossible points in space. The joy was real, but it was laced with something else. A sense of betrayal, a sense of, "How dare you?" How dare she leave them, and how dare she return as if no time had passed? Ilara finally reached the bottom of the ramp. She didn't slide into the ring. She just stopped, standing on the floor looking up at Serafina. The power dynamic was clear. The champion was on her pedestal. The ghost was on the ground. But it was the ghost who held all the power. The show cut to black, not on the champion, but on Ilara's cold, unforgiving eyes. The moment the broadcast feed died, the backstage gorilla position erupted into pure, unadulterated chaos. Headsets were screaming. "Who cleared that? Was that our feed? Is she even under contract?" Producers were running, slamming clipboards down, their faces ashen. This wasn't on the script. This wasn't on any script. The rest of the show's segments were useless. Every interview, every pre-taped package was now irrelevant. There was only one story. The boss, the man in charge of it all, simply sat in his chair, watching the monitor. A small, imperceptible smile played on his lips. He knew. He had to have known. But he hadn't told a soul. He hadn't told his lead writers, his producers, or even the commentary team. He had protected this secret, letting the shock land not just on the fans, but on his own infrastructure. The security team was scrambling. "Do we stop her? Is she a threat?" one guard yelled. But the boss just raised a hand. "Let it breathe," he said, his voice quiet, but cutting through the panic. This wasn't a security breach. This was a chess move. He had just detonated a bomb in his own company, and he wanted to watch every piece of shrapnel fly. The other wrestlers who had been waiting for their cue just stood there, their own matches forgotten. The entire hierarchy had just been thrown into a wood chipper. In the women's locker room, the atmosphere was a vacuum. The television monitor on the wall showed Ilara's face, and the room went from jovial post-show chatter to a tomb. The younger talent, the ones who had only heard stories of Ilara, looked confused. They saw her as a myth, a cautionary tale. The veterans, however, the ones who knew her, they understood. One wrestler, a former rival, just shook her head and started retaping her wrists, her expression grim. "Well," she muttered, "there goes the neighborhood." The champion's few allies were silent, glancing at each other, knowing their friend was now isolated. But the most telling reaction came from Ilara's former tag team partner, the one Serafina had replaced. She had been sitting in the corner, icing her knee. When Ilara's face appeared, she didn't look shocked. She didn't look happy. She just looked tired. She slowly stood up, grabbed her bag, and walked towards the door. Someone tried to ask her what she thought. She didn't even turn. "Some people," she said, her hand on the door, "just like to watch the world burn." She left, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed the clatter of the championship belt hitting the mat. The divide wasn't just in the ring. It was in this room. The fault line had reopened. The next 12 hours were a media inferno. Ilara wasn't just trending. It had broken analytics. Every sports website, every podcast, every news aggregator led with her image. The questions were frantic, and they weren't about a title shot. They were existential. Why now? Where has she been? What does this mean for Serafina's legacy? The narrative Serafina had carefully constructed over 3 years, the narrative of the loyal soldier who stayed, who picked up the pieces, who carried the division on her back while her partner quit, was now shattered. The media began digging. They re-examined Ilara's departure. They found the old interviews where Serafina dodged questions, where she painted Ilara as unstable, as a burnout. But now those interviews looked different. They looked self-serving. The pressure on the company was immense. They had a viral moment, but they had no control over the story. The fans were already turning. The cheers for Ilara were morphing into suspicion of Serafina. What did the champion know? Was she the victim, or was she the villain? The legacy wasn't just a talking point. It was a battleground. Ilara hadn't said a word, and yet she was already winning the war of perception simply by existing. The machine demanded an explanation, and the silence was more powerful than any promo could ever be. Hours after the broadcast, the arena was a dark, hollow shell. The cleaning crews were sweeping up the last of the confetti. In a small, unmarked locker room far from the main talent area, Ilara sat alone. The street clothes she wore were the same. She hadn't moved. She hadn't celebrated. She was just waiting. Her phone, an old, non-smartphone model, buzzed on the metal bench beside her. It was a single text message from a number she knew by heart. Her father. The message was simple. "Is it done?" She stared at the screen for a long time. The weight of her return had nothing to do with the roar of the crowd or the bright lights. It had everything to do with the 3 years she had spent in anonymity, the therapy, the physical rehabilitation from an injury no one knew she had, the long, agonizing process of rebuilding herself, not as a wrestler, but as a person. This return wasn't a triumph. It was a relapse. It was a conscious choice to step back into the fire that had almost consumed her. She typed a single word back. Yes. She felt no relief, no joy, only the cold, heavy burden of a promise she had made to herself, a promise that required her to face the one person she had spent 3 years trying to forget. This wasn't a comeback. It was an obligation. Why did she really leave? The public narrative was burnout. The dirt sheets claimed a contract dispute. The truth was a quiet, pathetic secret, buried in the memory of a hospital room. 3 years and 1 month ago. Ilara was lying in a bed, her knee reconstructed, the painkillers doing little to dull the ache. The injury had happened at a live event, a freak accident. The doctor said her career was likely over. She had waited for her best friend, her tag team partner, Serafina, to walk through the door. They were supposed to be sisters. They were supposed to conquer the world together. The visiting hours ticked by. Her phone remained dark. Then, a week later, she saw it on television. Serafina, accepting a new singles contract, debuting a new theme song, holding up a shirt that read, "The One." She hadn't just been replaced, she had been erased. Serafina had used her friend's injury as a launch pad, climbing on the wreckage of their shared dream to build her own. The burnout story? Ilara had planted that herself. It was easier to be seen as a quitter than as a victim. It was easier to disappear than to admit she had been so thoroughly and so perfectly betrayed. She didn't leave wrestling. She left her. It didn't happen on television. It happened the next day, in the cold anonymity of an airport terminal. Serafina, the champion, was at her gate, surrounded by bags, her title hidden in a custom-made carrier. She was trying to call her agent, her voice frantic, when she felt a shadow fall over her. She looked up. It was Ilara. No cameras, no crowd, just 2 people in a sea of strangers. Serafina immediately stood up, her face a mask of practiced calm. "Ilara," she said, as if greeting a distant acquaintance. You look good." Ilara didn't respond. She just stared, her eyes tracing the designer logos on Serafina's luggage, the diamond watch on her wrist, the championship carrier, all the spoils of a kingdom built on a lie. "All this," Ilara finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "And you're still so afraid." Serafina's composure cracked. "You don't know what I had to do," she hissed. "I survived. You ran." "You call this surviving?" Ilara asked, gesturing to the guarded, isolated champion. "It looks like a prison." Ilara didn't wait for an answer. She just turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before Serafina could even think of a reply. The champion was left shaking, not with anger, but with a cold, creeping dread. The ghost was real, and she didn't want the title. She wanted absolution. The silence was the new weapon. The following week on SmackDown, the show was built entirely around Ilara's response. The company, embracing the chaos, had given her the entire opening segment. The ring was empty, a single microphone on a stand in the center. The music hit. The crowd erupted. But Ilara didn't come out. The music played and played. The ramp remained empty. The camera held on the empty ring for 3 solid minutes. The cheers turned to confusion, then to boos. Backstage, the producers were apoplectic, but the boss just watched. This was the new story. Ilara wasn't going to play their game. She wasn't going to cut a promo. She wasn't going to explain herself. Her absence was her answer. Instead, it was Serafina who marched to the ring, her face purple with rage. She grabbed the microphone and screamed at the empty ramp. She screamed about loyalty, about betrayal, about how she had stayed when Ilara quit. But it was a trap. The more she yelled, the more she justified herself, the more guilty she looked. The fans, once so loyal, began to turn. Chants of, "You know what you did?" started to rain down. Ilara had weaponized her own disappearance, and in doing so had turned the champion into the villain of her own story without ever laying a hand on her. The story was set, the main event for the biggest show of the year. Serafina versus Ilara. The betrayal versus the ghost. The company was marketing it as the most personal war in a decade, but we, the audience, were missing the final piece. We end where we began, the arena, the moment of the return. The lights fading, the music box sound. But this time, we see a different angle. We see Ilara standing just behind the curtain in the darkness of the go position. She's holding her old, worn phone. She isn't looking at the crowd. She isn't focused on the ring. She is looking at a single photograph on her screen. It's not of Serafina. It's not of her family. It's a picture of a hospital room. Her own hospital room from 3 years ago. The one where she waited. The scar on her jaw? It wasn't from a match. It was from the car accident she got into after she left the hospital, dazed and heartbroken. She hadn't come back for the title. She hadn't come back for revenge. She hadn't even come back to save Serafina. She had come back, because she finally realized she was the only one who could save herself. The explosion of the crowd wasn't a welcome. It was the sound of her finally closing a door. The return wasn't the start of a war. It was the end of her grief. And she was the only one who knew it.